On April 22nd, 1724, in the Prussian city of Königsberg, a saddler's wife gave birth to her fourth child. The boy was named Immanuel. His father, Johann Georg Kant, worked with leather. His mother, Anna Regina, came from a family of craftsmen. The family lived modestly in a house on Sattler Street, surrounded by the smells of tanned hides and the sounds of Baltic commerce. Königsberg sat where the Pregel River met the sea. Ships brought amber, timber, and grain from the interior. The city had three parts, the Altstadt, the Lobenicht, and the Kneiphof, each with its own character, its own churches, its own rhythms. Between them stretched bridges that young Immanuel would cross thousands of times in his life. The household followed the teachings of Pietism, a Protestant movement that emphasized personal devotion over ritual. Anna Regina took this seriously. She brought her son to prayer meetings and taught him that inner moral conviction mattered more than outward display. The boy absorbed this quietly. He would later reject the emotionalism of Pietism, but never its insistence on moral rigor. At age 8, Immanuel entered the Collegium Fridericianum, a Pietist school that began each day at 5:30 in the morning. The curriculum was heavy: Latin, theology, mathematics, music. Students spent hours parsing ancient texts and memorizing scripture. The discipline was strict, the food was poor. Decades later, Kant would describe these years with distaste, remembering the enforced piety and the endless prayers. But something else happened at the Collegium. A teacher named Martin Knutzen recognized that the quiet boy from Sattler Street had an unusual mind. Knutzen taught mathematics and philosophy. He introduced his student to the new physics of Newton, to the rationalism of Leibniz and Wolff, to questions about how we know what we know. The boy began to read voraciously. In 1740, at 16, Immanuel enrolled at the University of Königsberg. The university was small but connected to the broader intellectual currents of Europe. Here he studied mathematics, physics, philosophy, and theology. He attended lectures on metaphysics that tried to prove God's existence through pure logic. He learned about mechanics and astronomy, about forces and orbits and the clockwork universe Newton had revealed. His mother died when he was 13. His father died when he was 22. The modest inheritance disappeared quickly. Kant left the university without completing his degree and took work as a private tutor. For 9 years, he lived in the households of wealthy families, teaching their children while continuing his own studies in whatever hours remained. He tutored in the countryside outside Königsberg, in manor houses where he was neither family nor servant. He taught children their Latin and mathematics. He observed how different social classes lived, how wealth shaped behavior, how people justified their positions. He was patient with his students, but already developing the routines that would define his life. He woke early, he read systematically, he took walks at the same time each day. During these years, he published his first work. In 1747, he wrote about the measurement of living forces, entering a debate in physics about how to calculate motion and energy. The work showed promise, but solved nothing definitively. In 1755, he published a more ambitious text, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens. In it, he proposed that the solar system had formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust, that stars were distant suns, that the Milky Way was a vast disk of such stars, and that countless such systems might exist throughout space. The theory was remarkable for its scope. Kant was trying to explain the origin of cosmic order through natural forces alone, without invoking divine intervention at every step. He called it a theory according to Newtonian principles. The book attracted little attention at the time. The publisher went bankrupt before distribution began, but the ideas were there, waiting. In 1755, Kant finally completed his doctoral requirements and began teaching at the University of Königsberg as a Privatdozent, paid directly by students who attended his lectures. He taught logic, metaphysics, mathematics, physical geography, anthropology, mineralogy, and natural law. His lectures were popular. Students found him engaging, full of examples drawn from travel literature, science, and contemporary affairs, even though he himself never traveled beyond the region. He applied repeatedly for a salaried professorship, but was passed over again and again. The positions went to others. He continued as a private lecturer, living in rented rooms, earning enough to survive but not to prosper. He kept a strict schedule. He wrote. He socialized in the evenings, playing cards, dining with friends, enjoying conversation. Those who knew him described a man who was witty, sociable, well-dressed, despite limited means, interested in everything. His daily walk became famous. Every afternoon at precisely the same time, he walked the same route through Königsberg. Neighbors claimed they set their clocks by his passing. The story became legend, embellished over time, but contained truth. Routine freed his mind. Regularity created space for thought. He never married. There are stories of interest in women during these years, of hesitation, of opportunities declined. He once remarked that when he could afford a wife, he no longer wanted one, and when he wanted one, he could not afford one. Whether this explanation satisfied him, no one knows. He lived alone, attended by a retired soldier named Lampe, who served as cook and manservant. By his late 30s, Kant had published works on earthquakes, on winds, on optimism, on the only possible ground for a demonstration of God's existence. He was known as a competent scholar, a good teacher, a man of regular habits and broad knowledge. Nothing suggested he would revolutionize philosophy. Nothing indicated that the work taking shape in his mind would redraw the boundaries of human thought. On November 1st, 1755, an earthquake destroyed Lisbon. The shaking began mid-morning on All Saints' Day, while churches filled with worshippers. 3 massive tremors in 10 minutes brought down cathedrals, palaces, and hospitals. Fires erupted across the ruined city. Then came the tsunami, 3 waves that swept through the harbor and lower districts, drowning those who had fled to the waterfront. Between 60,000 and 100,000 people died. News of the disaster spread slowly across Europe, carried by ships and riders, arriving in fragments. Lisbon burning, the royal family surviving, thousands buried in rubble, a city erased. The earthquake became the great public catastrophe of the age, discussed in salons and universities, in pamphlets and sermons. Everyone had an explanation. Most involved God's judgment. In Königsberg, Kant read everything he could find about the earthquake. He collected reports from Lisbon, accounts from survivors, observations from other cities that had felt the tremors. He studied the geology, the timing, the spread of destruction. Then he wrote. Between January and April 1756, he published 3 papers on earthquakes. They were scientific works, not theological ones. He examined how subterranean fires and gases might cause the earth to shake. He noted that earthquakes often occurred in coastal regions and volcanic areas. He proposed that vast caverns beneath the surface, filled with combustible materials, might collapse or explode, sending shockwaves through the ground. He was wrong about many details, but right about the method. Earthquakes were natural phenomena with natural causes. This seems obvious now. It was less obvious then. Many educated Europeans believed natural disasters expressed divine will. Lisbon's destruction on a holy day, in a Catholic country known for its Inquisition, seemed too pointed to be chance. Voltaire wrote his poem on the Lisbon disaster, questioning how a benevolent God could permit such suffering. Rousseau responded that God was not to blame, humans were, for building cities in earthquake zones. The disaster became a theological crisis, a problem of evil, a question about providence. Kant avoided these arguments. His papers focused on mechanics, not meaning. Yet the question lingered beneath his research. If earthquakes had natural causes, if they followed physical laws, if they struck without regard for virtue or vice, what role remained for divine governance? And if humans could not predict or prevent such catastrophes, what were the limits of human knowledge? In 1756, the 7 Years' War began. Prussia fought Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden. Königsberg lay in East Prussia, vulnerable to Russian advance. In 1758, Russian forces occupied the city. The occupation lasted 4 years. Kant continued teaching, now technically under Russian administration. He swore an oath of loyalty to Empress Elizabeth. The war disrupted trade but left the university mostly intact. Kant observed occupation firsthand, how power changed hands, how people adapted, how treaties rearranged the map. When the war ended in 1763, Prussia survived. Frederick the Great, having nearly lost everything, emerged with his kingdom intact and his reputation enhanced. The war had killed hundreds of thousands. It had bankrupted treasuries and devastated provinces. But in Königsberg, life resumed. Kant was 39 years old, still a private lecturer, still waiting for a professorship. That same year, he published his Inquiry Concerning the Distinctness of the Principles of Natural Theology and Morality, an essay that won second prize in a competition sponsored by the Prussian Academy of Sciences. The essay argued that mathematics and philosophy required different methods. In mathematics, you begin with clear definitions and derive certainties. In philosophy, you start with confused concepts and try to clarify them. You cannot simply imitate mathematical proof in metaphysics. The observation sounds technical. It pointed towards something larger, a growing suspicion that traditional philosophy had been asking questions it could not answer with the tools it was using. He published another work in 1763, the only possible argument in support of a demonstration of the existence of God. The title promised a proof. The book delivered something more ambiguous. Kant argued that something must exist necessarily, that absolute non-existence was impossible. But he grew increasingly uncertain whether human reason could demonstrate that this necessary being was God as traditionally conceived, omnipotent, benevolent, personal. He was beginning to doubt whether metaphysics as practiced for centuries could succeed. The great questions, does God exist? Is the soul immortal? Are we free or determined? Had generated endless debate but no resolution. Different philosophers built elaborate systems that contradicted each other. All claimed to derive their conclusions from reason alone, yet reason seemed to prove opposite conclusions with equal force. In 1764, he published Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, a short book exploring aesthetic experience and human temperament. It was less technical than his other works, more accessible, touched with humor and observation. He discussed different national characters, the psychology of men and women, the varieties of aesthetic response. Some passages reflected the casual prejudices of his time and place. Others showed a mind attentive to the diversity of human experience, interested in how emotion and reason intertwined. He was teaching constantly during these years. His lecture schedule was exhausting. Physical geography on Monday and Thursday, logic on Tuesday and Friday, metaphysics on Wednesday and Saturday, mathematics and natural law as needed. He prepared his own lecture notes, revising them each semester. Students crowded his lectures. He spoke without reading, using only brief notes, engaging his audience with examples, anecdotes, digressions. He earned enough to live comfortably, though not luxuriously. In 1766, he published Dreams of a Spirit Seer, a strange and mocking work that attacked the mystical visions of Immanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish scientist turned religious visionary who claimed to communicate with angels and spirits. Swedenborg's followers were spreading across Europe. Kant had acquired Swedenborg's books and found them absurd. But the essay was not merely mockery. Kant asked, what allows us to dismiss Swedenborg's claims? Only that they contradict experience and reason. But how do we know the limits of possible experience? What separates legitimate metaphysics from ghost stories? The question was becoming urgent. If traditional metaphysics could not prove its conclusions, if it could not distinguish itself from mysticism, if it generated contradictions rather than knowledge, perhaps the entire enterprise needed reconceiving. Perhaps the problem was not that philosophers had reached wrong conclusions, but that they had been attempting the impossible. By the late 1760s, Kant's thinking was shifting. He read David Hume, the Scottish philosopher who argued that causation was merely habit, that we observe sequences but never necessary connections, that reason could not justify induction or prove substance or demonstrate self. Hume's skepticism was radical. Kant later wrote that Hume interrupted his dogmatic slumber. The phrase suggests an awakening. In 1770, the University of Königsberg finally offered Kant a professorship in logic and metaphysics. He was 46 years old. He had been teaching for 15 years as a private lecturer. The position came with a salary, an office, security. He accepted immediately. To mark the occasion, he wrote an inaugural dissertation on the form and principles of the sensible and intelligible world. The dissertation introduced ideas that would dominate his thinking for the next decade. Space and time, he argued, were not properties of things themselves, but forms of human sensibility, the structure through which we receive sensory information. This was new. It suggested that our knowledge of the world was shaped fundamentally by the nature of our minds, not just by the nature of objects. Objects must conform to our ways of perceiving them. We do not see things as they are in themselves. We see them as they appear through the filters of space and time. The dissertation received polite attention. Kant sent copies to prominent philosophers in Germany. Some responses were encouraging, others were puzzled. The ideas seemed radical, even strange. But Kant did not rush to publish more. He retreated into silence. For the next 11 years, he published almost nothing. He lectured, he revised his notes, he thought. Students and colleagues wondered what had happened to the productive scholar who had published so prolifically in the previous decades. He told friends he was working on something important, something that required time. He called it a critique of reason itself. In the winter of 1772, Kant wrote a letter to his former student, Marcus Hertz. The letter explained the problem occupying his mind. How can our concepts apply to objects we experience? When we think about cause and effect, or substance, or unity, we are using concepts that go beyond immediate sensation. What guarantees that these concepts match reality? Previous philosophers had assumed a pre-established harmony between mind and world, often attributed to God. But this was not an answer. This was postponing the question. Kant proposed something different. Perhaps our concepts do not conform to objects. Perhaps objects conform to our concepts. Perhaps the mind is not a passive receiver of information, but an active organizer of experience. This would explain how we can have universal and necessary knowledge, not because we grasp things as they are in themselves, but because we grasp things as they must appear to any mind structured like ours. He called this a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had reversed the relationship between earth and sun, Kant would reverse the relationship between mind and world. The change was not in what we observe, but in how we understand observation itself. He told Hertz he would finish the work in 3 months. 3 months became 11 years. During this period, Kant lived according to rigid routine. He woke at 5 each morning. His servant Lampe had instructions to be insistent. Kant drank tea and smoked his pipe. He prepared lectures. He worked on his manuscript. He taught from 7 until 9, then again from 11 to 12. He wrote until lunch. He invited friends for the midday meal, which often lasted hours, filled with conversation ranging across science, politics, literature, gossip. After lunch came the famous walk, the route through Königsberg that became a local landmark. Evenings were for lighter reading or social calls. He retired at 10. The routine varied little across years. He lived in rented rooms on Prinzessin Street, keeping his possessions sparse. He dressed carefully, attending to appearance even as he aged. He enjoyed company, but needed solitude. He was financially comfortable now, neither wealthy nor struggling, careful with money, but not miserly. His health was delicate. He suffered from digestive problems, occasional insomnia, sensitivity to weather. He developed his own theories about managing these ailments, some sensible, others eccentric. He believed strongly in the power of mental discipline over physical discomfort. He breathed only through his nose during walks, convinced this prevented colds. He wore a sleeping cap he had designed himself. He controlled his diet carefully. Whether these measures helped or simply gave him a sense of control, they became part of his system. The manuscript grew slowly. He wrote on loose sheets of paper, revising constantly, building arguments, tearing them down, rebuilding. The structure became increasingly complex. He was not writing a book that presented a system. He was writing a book that examined whether systematic knowledge was possible, and, if so, how. The work had 3 main questions. What can I know? This was the theoretical question concerning science and metaphysics. What ought I to do? This was the practical question concerning morality. What may I hope? This was the question about meaning, purpose, the relationship between is and ought. The first critique would address the first question, the nature of human knowledge, the conditions of possible experience, the limits of reason. By 1780, Kant was 56 years old. The manuscript was nearly complete. He sent sections to Hertz asking for feedback. Hertz found it difficult. Other colleagues warned that the book would be incomprehensible. Kant pressed forward. In May 1781, Critique of Pure Reason appeared, published in Riga by Johann Friedrich Hartknoch. The first edition sold slowly. Reviews were confused or hostile. Critics complained about obscurity, about length, about terminology. Some suspected Kant of disguised skepticism, of undermining religion despite protestations otherwise. Others found the book simply unreadable. The philosophical establishment, trained in the rationalist systems of Wolff and Baumgarten, did not know what to make of this strange hybrid of empiricism and rationalism, this text that seemed simultaneously to limit reason and to vindicate it. Kant was disappointed but not surprised. He had warned friends the book would be difficult. He began planning a revision. He wrote shorter, more accessible works to clarify his position. But the ideas were out, and a few readers grasped their significance. A younger generation of philosophers began studying the critique seriously, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted. The book began with a simple observation. Our knowledge starts with experience. All our concepts ultimately trace back to what we encounter through the senses. This much was empiricist. But Kant added a crucial turn. Although knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that knowledge arises only from experience. The mind contributes something essential to knowledge. It provides the framework within which experience becomes intelligible. Consider space. We experience objects as located in space, as extended, as positioned relative to each other. But we never experience space itself. We cannot see or touch empty space. Space is the form of outer intuition, the structure we impose on sensory data to organize it. Every object we perceive is necessarily in space, not because space is a property of things themselves, but because spatiality is a condition of our perceiving anything at all. The same applies to time. We experience events as sequential, as lasting, as simultaneous or successive. But time itself is not an object of perception. It is the form of inner sense, the structure within which we order all experience, both outer and inner. Causality, the idea that one event produces another, occurs in time. Memory occurs in time. Consciousness itself is temporal. If space and time are contributed by the mind, then anything we can experience must be spatial and temporal. This is not a limitation imposed by objects, but by our mode of perception. We cannot experience objects outside space and time because space and time are the conditions of experience itself. This means geometry is universally valid, not because space out there follows geometric rules, but because our form of perceiving anything out there is geometric. This solved a problem that had plagued philosophy. How can mathematics be both necessary and informative? Rationalists said mathematical truths were analytic, derived from definitions alone, but this made them trivial. Empiricists said they were synthetic, drawn from experience, but this made them contingent. Kant said they were synthetic a priori, informative yet necessary. Geometry tells us about all possible spatial experience because it describes the structure of space itself, which is our form of intuition. The argument extended beyond mathematics. Science depends on principles that seem necessary. Every event has a cause. Substance persists through change. These are not mere generalizations from experience. We presuppose them when interpreting experience. But how can we justify these principles? Not by appeal to the nature of things in themselves, which we cannot access independently of experience. Rather, by recognizing that these principles are conditions of possible experience, structures the mind imposes to make experience coherent. Kant called these structures categories. There were 12 of them, divided into 4 groups. Categories of quantity, unity, plurality, totality. Categories of quality, reality, negation, limitation. Categories of relation, substance, cause, community. Categories of modality, possibility, existence, necessity. These categories do not describe features of things in themselves. They describe the ways the understanding must organize sensory data to generate objective experience. The claim was radical. We do not know things as they are in themselves. We know appearances, phenomena, things as they are for us. There is a realm beyond appearances, the realm of things in themselves, which Kant called noumena. But this realm is unknowable. We can think about it, posit it as the ground of appearances, but we cannot experience it or describe it. The boundary of possible knowledge is the boundary of possible experience. This had immediate consequences for traditional metaphysics. Philosophers had long tried to prove the existence of God through pure reason. They had constructed ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments. Kant examined each type systematically. All failed. Not because God does not exist, but because existence is not the sort of thing pure reason can demonstrate. The categories apply only within experience. They cannot be extended beyond experience to prove transcendent realities. The same applied to the soul. Rationalist philosophers had argued that the soul is a simple, immaterial, immortal substance. They based this on the unity of consciousness. I think therefore I exist as a thinking thing. But Kant showed that unity of consciousness does not prove substantial unity. The self we experience is a flow of mental states unified by the same conditions that unify all experience. Whether there exists a soul substance beyond this empirical self, we cannot know. The question exceeds the limits of possible knowledge. Free will faced similar problems. Our experience of nature is thoroughly causal. Every event follows from prior events according to laws. If human actions are natural events, they too must be causally determined. But morality seems to require freedom. Can we reconcile these? Not through theoretical reason, Kant argued. We cannot prove we are free, but neither can we prove we are not free. The question lies beyond the reach of the categories. The first critique appeared in a German intellectual landscape dominated by 2 traditions. Rationalists like Leibniz and Wolff believed that reason alone could discover truths about reality. They built elaborate systems deducing the nature of God, substance, and the soul from logical principles. Empiricists like Locke and Hume insisted that all knowledge came from experience. They were skeptical of grand metaphysical claims that went beyond what the senses could verify. Each tradition had strengths. Each faced difficulties. Rationalism produced certainty, but at the cost of connection to reality. Its truth seemed empty, derived from definitions rather than from the world. Empiricism stayed close to experience, but could not explain the necessity we find in mathematics and natural science. Hume's skepticism was the logical endpoint. If all knowledge comes from experience, we can never be certain that the future will resemble the past, or that causation is anything more than habit. Kant refused to choose between these traditions. He absorbed both. Knowledge requires 2 elements, sensibility and understanding. Sensibility gives us raw data through intuition. Understanding organizes that data through concepts. Neither alone suffices. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Concepts without intuitions are empty. The mind is neither a blank slate nor a self-sufficient reason. It is a structured receiver and active organizer. Sensibility operates through two pure forms, space and time. These are not concepts we derive from experience. They are the preconditions for having experience at all. Before we encounter any particular object, we already possess the capacity to locate objects spatially and temporally. An infant does not learn that things exist in space. Spatial organization is built into perception from the beginning. This was not idealism in Berkeley's sense. Berkeley had argued that objects exist only in the mind, that material substance is an incoherent notion, that to be is to be perceived. Kant rejected this. Objects exist independently of our perception, but we can only know them as they appear to us, never as they are in themselves. There is a reality beyond appearances, but it is transcendently inaccessible. We are stuck behind the veil of our own cognitive structure. The argument about space had profound implications. Euclidean geometry had been considered the science of space itself, describing how space really is. Kant agreed that geometry is necessary and universal, but he relocated its necessity. Geometry is certain because it describes the form of all possible outer intuition. Any being with our sensory structure would experience a Euclidean world, not because space itself is Euclidean, but because our way of intuiting outer objects is Euclidean. This raised questions that would only be answered generations later. What if there are other geometries? What if space itself is not Euclidean? In the 19th century, mathematicians developed non-Euclidean geometries. In the 20th century, Einstein's relativity showed that physical space is curved, not flat. These developments seemed to refute Kant, but the situation is more subtle. Kant was describing the structure of perceptual experience, not the geometry of physical theory. Whether his account of space as a form of intuition survives modern physics remains debated. Time was more fundamental than space. Space is the form of outer sense, applying to objects we perceive as external. Time is the form of inner sense, applying to all mental states. Every thought, every emotion, every sensation occurs in time. Time is the universal form of intuition. Even our awareness of spatial objects is temporal. Perception unfolds in time. Memory requires time. The unity of consciousness across moments requires time. This made time central to Kant's account of self-knowledge. When I introspect, I encounter a stream of mental states ordered temporally. I do not encounter a substantial self, an immaterial soul thing that has these states. I encounter only the states themselves, unified by their temporal order. The self I know is an empirical self, a phenomenon like any other, subject to the same conditions of possible experience. But there must be something that does the knowing. Kant called this the transcendental unity of apperception. It is the I think that must be able to accompany all my representations. It is not itself an object of experience, it is the condition of experience. Without it, mental states would not be states of a single consciousness. They would be scattered data with no unifying perspective. This transcendental self is not the soul of rational metaphysics. It is a formal requirement, not a substantial entity. The understanding contributes the second element, categories. Sensibility gives us manifold intuitions. Understanding synthesizes these intuitions into unified objects of experience. It does this by applying concepts. Some concepts are empirical, derived from experience, dog, tree, mountain. But some concepts are pure, not derived from experience, but necessary for having experience. These are the categories. Kant derived the categories from the forms of judgment. Logic, as it had been understood since Aristotle, classified judgments according to their form. Judgments could be universal, particular, or singular, affirmative, negative, or infinite, categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive, problematic, assertoric, or apodeictic. Kant argued that each form of judgment corresponds to a category of understanding, a pure concept through which the mind organizes intuitions. The category of causation was particularly important. Hume had argued that we never perceive causation. We see one event followed by another. We observe constant conjunction, but we never observe the necessary connection that makes one event produce another. Causation for Hume is just psychological habit projected onto the world. Kant agreed that we do not perceive causation directly, but he disagreed that causation is merely habit. Causation is a category, a rule the understanding applies to organize temporal experience. When we experience events in time, we do not experience them as mere succession. We experience them as objectively ordered. Some sequences are reversible. I can look at the top of a house, then the bottom, then the top again. The order is subjective, determined by my attention. Other sequences are irreversible. A ship moves downstream. I see it first at one point, then at another downstream. I cannot reverse this sequence. The objective order is given by the causal structure. The ship's later position is caused by its earlier position and the current. Causation, then, is not a feature of things in themselves. It is a rule the mind uses to distinguish objective sequences from subjective ones. Without the category of causation, experience would collapse into disconnected impressions. There would be no distinction between perception and hallucination, between real events and imagined ones. The category makes objective experience possible. The same structure applied to substance. We experience changes, but we interpret these changes as states of enduring objects. The wax melts, but we say the wax persists through the change. We do not experience the underlying substance directly. We experience qualities, shape, color, texture, but we organize these qualities as belonging to a substance that remains identical across time. This is the work of the category of substance. It is the rule that there must be something permanent underlying change. Kant devoted enormous effort to proving that the categories apply necessarily within experience. These proofs, which he called transcendental deductions, were the most difficult and controversial parts of the critique. The basic strategy was this: show that without the categories, unified experience would be impossible. Show that self-consciousness requires objective experience. Conclude that the categories are valid for all objects of possible experience. The argument was subtle and complex. Kant himself was unsatisfied with the first edition's presentation. When he revised the critique for the second edition in 1787, he rewrote the transcendental deduction entirely, simplifying and clarifying. Even in the revised version, readers struggled. The deduction remains one of the most difficult passages in modern philosophy, generating interpretations and counter-interpretations for 2 centuries. But the conclusion was clear enough. The categories are valid within experience. They structure the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to beings like us. They do not describe the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. We cannot know whether things in themselves are causal or substantial or quantifiable. We can only know that any experience we have will be structured causally, substantially, quantitatively, because these are the structures our understanding imposes. This position was neither rationalism nor empiricism. It was not rationalism because the categories do not give us knowledge of things in themselves. We cannot use pure reason to deduce truths about reality independent of experience. It was not empiricism because the categories are not derived from experience. They are preconditions of experience. Kant called his position transcendental idealism, but he might equally have called it empirical realism. Within experience, objects are real, causation is real, knowledge is possible. But experience itself is conditioned by the structure of the mind. The implications rippled outward. If we can only know appearances, what status do scientific laws have? They are universally valid within the phenomenal realm. Newton's laws describe how objects in space and time necessarily behave, not because nature in itself follows these laws, but because these laws express how we must structure spatial and temporal experience. Science is secure within its domain, but that domain is limited to possible experience. Mathematics too finds its ground. Arithmetic is the science of time's structure. Geometry is the science of space's structure. Both are synthetic a priori. Informative because they describe the structure of intuition, necessary because all experience must conform to these structures. 7 plus 5 equals 12, not because we have examined all possible groups of 7 and 5, but because temporal succession has a structure that makes this sum necessary for any finite beings who count. The architecture Kant was building had a place for everything: sensibility with its forms, understanding with its categories, the phenomenal realm structured by both, the noumenal realm remaining unknowable beyond. Each element had its function. Each boundary had its justification. The system was designed to preserve scientific knowledge while limiting metaphysical speculation, to explain certainty while accepting limitation. The distinction between phenomena and noumena was central and controversial. Phenomena are appearances, things as they are for us. Noumena are things as they are in themselves, independent of our perceiving and conceiving them. We know phenomena. We cannot know noumena. This seemed clear. But the problems began immediately. If we cannot know things in themselves, can we even speak of them? Can we meaningfully refer to something we cannot in principle experience or describe? Kant's answer shifted across his writings. Sometimes the thing in itself seemed to be a definite reality behind appearances, the cause of our sensations, the ground of phenomenal objects. Other times it seemed to be merely a limiting concept, a reminder of the boundaries of knowledge, not a positive claim about what exists beyond those boundaries. The tension was genuine. On one hand, Kant needed things in themselves. Without them, his position collapsed into Berkeleyan idealism. the view that objects exist only in minds. Kant repeatedly insisted he was not Berkeley. There is an external reality. Objects exist when no one perceives them. Space is empirically real, even though transcendentally ideal. The thing in itself represents this external reality, the source of the sensory data we organize into experience. On the other hand, if things in themselves are completely unknowable, what justifies saying anything about them? We cannot say they cause our sensations, because causation is a category that applies only within experience. We cannot say they exist, because existence is a category. We cannot even say they are things in any meaningful sense, because thinghood involves categories. The thing in itself threatens to become an incoherent notion, something we must posit but cannot think. Kant was aware of this problem. In the first edition of the Critique, he drew a distinction between noumena in a positive sense and noumena in a negative sense. In the positive sense, a noumenon would be an object of intellectual intuition, something a purely rational being could know directly without sensory input. But we have no intellectual intuition. We cannot know noumena positively. In the negative sense, a noumenon is simply the concept of something that is not an object of our sensory intuition. It marks the limit of our knowledge without claiming positive knowledge of what lies beyond. This helped, but the difficulty remained. If the thing in itself is merely a limiting concept, why does Kant sometimes speak as if it exists independently, as if it affects our sensibility, as if it grounds appearances? The answer seems to be that Kant operated on two levels. From within the critical philosophy, we cannot make claims about things in themselves, but we can reflect on the critical philosophy from outside, recognizing that it is a philosophy of human knowledge structured by human cognitive capacities, and that this very structure implies something beyond itself. The problem became a focal point for Kant's successors. Fichte argued that things in themselves should be eliminated entirely. If they are unknowable, they are unnecessary. The entire system can be derived from the structure of self-consciousness alone. Schelling and Hegel developed elaborate systems attempting to overcome the subject-object divide, to reach absolute knowledge that transcends the limits Kant had set. These efforts generated German idealism, a movement that dominated philosophy for decades. But perhaps the tension in Kant's position was not a failure but an honest recognition of the human situation. We are embedded in reality. We are part of the natural world. But we can only know that world as it appears through our particular cognitive structure. We know we are limited, but we cannot transcend that limitation. We point toward the thing in itself not to describe it, but to acknowledge our finitude. The doctrine had ethical and existential implications. If we cannot know ultimate reality, then all our certainties are conditional. Science gives us secure knowledge of the phenomenal world, but it does not reveal the deepest nature of things. This could be experienced as loss. We cannot know what we truly are, what the universe truly is, whether there is purpose or meaning at the fundamental level. The Enlightenment dream of total transparency, of reason penetrating all mysteries, was over. But Kant did not experience this as tragedy. He experienced it as liberation. The limits of theoretical reason created space for practical reason, for morality, for freedom. If determinism were not just a feature of phenomena, but an ultimate truth about reality itself, moral responsibility would be impossible. If we could theoretically prove that God exists and the soul is immortal, moral action would become self-interested calculation rather than duty. The unknowability of things in themselves was not a bug, but a feature. The critical philosophy established a boundary. On one side, science, mathematics, empirical knowledge of nature. These domains were secure within their limits. On the other side, metaphysical speculation about ultimate reality. This was not knowledge, but faith, hope, or postulation. Kant was not abolishing metaphysics, he was relocating it. Metaphysics could not be theoretical science, but it might be practical necessity. The first critique spent considerable energy demolishing traditional metaphysical arguments. Kant examined three types of argument for God's existence. The ontological argument claimed that existence is part of God's essence, so God must exist. Kant replied that existence is not a predicate, not a property things can have or lack. Saying something exists adds no content to its concept. 100 real thalers contains no more content than 100 possible thalers. The difference is whether they exist, not what they are. The cosmological argument claimed that everything contingent requires a cause, so there must be a necessary being that causes all else. Kant replied that this argument smuggles in the ontological argument at the end. Even if we grant that something must exist necessarily, we cannot infer that this necessary being has the attributes of God. And the argument illegitimately extends the category of causation beyond possible experience. The teleological argument claimed that the order and purpose apparent in nature requires an intelligent designer. Kant had more respect for this argument. The appearance of design in organisms and ecosystems is striking. But the argument proves at most an architect who shapes matter, not a creator who produces matter from nothing. It proves at most a very powerful and intelligent being, not an infinite and perfect one. And it remains an argument from analogy, projecting features of human intelligence onto the universe. Each refutation was careful and respectful. Kant was not attacking religion. He was showing that theoretical reason could not provide what believers sought. Faith could not rest on proof. This would become a major theme in his moral philosophy. For now, he simply established that the great questions of traditional metaphysics exceeded the capacity of human reason to answer theoretically. He applied the same scrutiny to rational psychology, the attempt to prove that the soul is a simple, immaterial, immortal substance. The arguments rested on a mistake he called the paralogism of pure reason. From the unity of consciousness, philosophers inferred substantial unity. From the fact that I think, they inferred that I am a thinking thing, a substance whose essence is thought. But this inference was invalid. The I think is a formal condition of experience, not knowledge of a substantial self. Kant argued that we commit a fallacy when we treat the transcendental unity of apperception as if it were knowledge of an object. We know the empirical self through inner sense, as a flow of mental states in time. We do not know any substantial self behind these states. Perhaps such a self exists. Perhaps consciousness requires an immaterial substrate. But we cannot prove this through pure reason. The question lies beyond the limits of theoretical knowledge. Cosmology fared no better. Philosophers had long debated whether the universe had a beginning in time or existed eternally, whether space was finite or infinite, whether matter was composed of simple parts or divisible infinitely, whether there was freedom or only determinism. Kant argued that pure reason generates antinomies when it addresses these questions. For each position, an equally compelling argument supports the opposite position. Consider the question of whether the world had a beginning. Thesis. The world must have had a beginning because an infinite past series is impossible. If the world had no beginning, an infinite series of events would have already occurred. But an infinite series can never be completed. Therefore, the world must have begun. Antithesis. The world had no beginning because if it began, there must have been an empty time before it. But nothing can arise from empty time, since no part of empty time differs from any other part. Therefore, the world is eternal. Both arguments seem valid. Both use pure reason, yet they contradict each other. Kant's diagnosis: both arguments illegitimately treat the world as a thing in itself. The world is the totality of appearances. Appearances exist only in experience. Questions about the totality of experience cannot be answered from within experience. The antinomies arise from trying to apply categories beyond their proper domain. The solution preserved both science and morality. Within experience, determinism holds. Every event has a cause. Natural science investigates these causal chains, but things in themselves might not be determined. Freedom might be possible at the noumenal level, even though it cannot be proven theoretically. This would be crucial for ethics. Moral responsibility requires freedom. The critical philosophy makes space for freedom by limiting theoretical knowledge. The antinomies revealed something troubling about human reason. When reason turns toward ultimate questions, when it tries to grasp the totality of things, it generates contradictions. This is not accidental, it is structural. Reason has a natural tendency to seek the unconditioned, to move from condition to condition, from cause to cause, until it reaches something final and complete. But this movement can never be completed within experience. Experience gives us only conditioned things, only causes that are themselves caused. The unconditioned lies perpetually beyond reach. Kant distinguished between two faculties, understanding and reason. Understanding applies categories to intuitions, generating empirical knowledge. It works within experience, connecting perceptions through rules. Reason operates differently. It seeks unity, totality, completion. It takes the outputs of understanding and tries to organize them into systematic wholes. This is legitimate when reason regulates our pursuit of knowledge, encouraging us to seek deeper explanations and more comprehensive theories. It becomes problematic when reason claims to constitute knowledge of transcendent objects. The ideas of pure reason are three: the soul, the world, and God. These are not concepts of objects we might experience. They are ideas toward which reason necessarily tends. The soul is the idea of absolute unity of the thinking subject. The world is the idea of absolute unity of all conditions of appearance. God is the idea of absolute unity of all objects of thought. These ideas serve a purpose. They guide inquiry, they set goals for investigation, but they do not give us knowledge. Traditional metaphysics had treated these ideas as if they were concepts of real objects knowable through pure reason. Rational psychology claimed to know the soul's nature. Rational cosmology claimed to know the world's structure. Rational theology claimed to prove God's existence. Kant argued that all three disciplines rested on illusion, not malicious deception, but natural and inevitable illusion arising from reason's structure. We cannot help forming these ideas. We can only prevent ourselves from mistaking them for knowledge. The Critique of Pure Reason devoted hundreds of pages to dismantling arguments that had occupied philosophers for centuries. Kant worked through each proof methodically, showing where it went wrong, how it exceeded the limits of possible experience, why it could not deliver what it promised. The tone was not gleeful. Kant took these arguments seriously. He recognized their power and their appeal, but he was convinced they failed. The demolition was thorough. By the time Kant finished, little remained of traditional metaphysics as a theoretical science. But he insisted this was not skepticism. Hume had been skeptical about causation, substance, and self. Kant defended all three within experience. Science was secure, mathematics was certain, empirical knowledge was possible. Only metaphysical speculation beyond experience was impossible. This distinction was crucial. Kant's position was called critical philosophy because it examined reason itself, determining what reason could and could not accomplish. The examination yielded both positive and negative results. Positively, it showed how synthetic a priori knowledge was possible in mathematics and natural science. Negatively, it showed why similar knowledge was impossible in metaphysics. The critique concluded with a reflection on the fate of metaphysics. Once called the queen of all sciences, metaphysics had fallen into disrepute. Endless controversies had produced no consensus. Different schools proposed contradictory systems. The lack of progress contrasted sharply with advances in mathematics and natural science. Some concluded that metaphysics should be abandoned entirely. Kant disagreed. Metaphysics was not pointless. It was in need of reform. The reform required accepting limits. Theoretical reason cannot prove God, freedom, or immortality. It cannot describe things in themselves or the totality of reality. But accepting these limits does not mean abandoning the questions. It means addressing them differently. Perhaps what theoretical reason cannot establish, practical reason requires. Perhaps morality provides what metaphysics cannot. This was the bridge to Kant's next project. The first critique had asked, "What can I know?" It established the conditions and limits of theoretical knowledge. But Kant had two more questions. What ought I to do? What may I hope? These questions required their own investigations. Theoretical knowledge was not everything. Perhaps it was not even the most important thing. Kant spent the years after 1781 defending and clarifying the first critique. He wrote the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics in 1783, a shorter and more accessible presentation of the critical philosophy. The Prolegomena approached the material differently, starting from the fact of mathematical and scientific knowledge and working backward to its conditions. It was intended for readers who had struggled with the critique, offering a clearer path through the arguments. He also responded to reviews and criticisms. Many readers misunderstood his position. Some thought he denied the reality of the external world. Others thought he made everything arbitrary, as if space and time were personal choices rather than objective structures. Kant patiently explained. Space and time are empirically real. Objects exist independently of particular observers. What is ideal is the form of intuition, not the objects intuited. The theologian J.F. Flatt wrote that Kant's system left no room for revelation or faith. Kant responded that this was exactly the point. By showing the limits of theoretical knowledge, he had removed obstacles to faith. If God's existence could be proven, faith would be superfluous. If theoretical reason could demonstrate immortality, moral behavior would become prudential calculation. The critical philosophy made room for faith by establishing that reason cannot settle these questions definitively. In 1786, Kant published Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, applying the critical philosophy to physics. He argued that matter requires both attractive and repulsive forces. He explored the relationship between his philosophical account of space and Newton's mathematical physics. The work demonstrated that the critical philosophy was not hostile to science, but provided its foundation. He was teaching throughout these years, lecturing on logic, metaphysics, ethics, anthropology, and physical geography. His lectures on anthropology were particularly popular. They covered human nature, character types, national differences, the relationship between body and mind. Students appreciated the concrete examples and the engagement with empirical psychology alongside abstract philosophy. His habits remained rigid. The afternoon walk continued daily unless weather made it impossible. Rain did not deter him. His servant followed with an umbrella. Kant walked regardless, maintaining the schedule that had become legendary. Neighbors could predict his passing within minutes. When he occasionally altered his route, it became news in the city. He dined regularly with a small circle of friends. The rule was between 3 and 9 guests, never 2, never more than 9. Conversation ranged freely. Kant discouraged purely academic talk at meals. He preferred discussions of current events, travel, natural phenomena, social questions. He told stories, asked questions, kept the conversation flowing. Those who dined with him remarked on his humor and sociability, his curiosity about lives different from his own. He remained unmarried. By his 50s, this was no longer remarkable. He lived comfortably in his routines, supported by his servant, surrounded by books and papers, visited by colleagues and students. If he felt loneliness, he did not discuss it. His correspondence focused on intellectual matters, not personal ones. His emotional life remains largely unknown. In 1787, the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason appeared. Kant had revised substantial sections, particularly the transcendental deduction and the refutation of idealism. He wanted to clarify misunderstandings and strengthen weak arguments. The changes were significant but did not alter the basic structure. The second edition became the standard text, though scholars still debate whether the first edition better represents Kant's original insight. The critique had by now begun to attract serious attention. Younger philosophers in Germany recognized that something important had occurred. Karl Leonhard Reinhold popularized the critical philosophy through a series of letters published in a prominent journal. Johann Schultz defended it against critics. The system was spreading, generating disciples and opponents, reshaping the philosophical landscape. But Kant was already moving forward. He had established the limits of theoretical knowledge. He had shown what we can and cannot know about nature, self, and God. The project was incomplete. The first critique had been concerned primarily with cognition. It had touched on morality only briefly, mainly to show that freedom was at least possible, not refuted by natural determinism. But morality deserved its own systematic treatment. Kant began work on what would become the Critique of Practical Reason. But first came a shorter work that laid the groundwork. In 1785, he published Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, a book that would prove as influential as the Critique, a book that transformed ethics as thoroughly as the first Critique had transformed epistemology. Kant's study overlooked a courtyard on Prinzessin Street. The room was sparse. A desk, shelves of books, a portrait of Rousseau on the wall. Rousseau was the only portrait. Kant had read Emile in 1762 and had been deeply affected. Rousseau argued that humans are naturally good but corrupted by society. He emphasized feeling and conscience over abstract reason. He celebrated ordinary people over sophisticated elites. This was not Kant's temperament, but something in Rousseau's work moved him. It convinced him that theoretical knowledge was not the highest human achievement, that the value of a person lay not in intelligence but in moral worth. The insight shaped everything that followed. When Kant turned to ethics, he brought the same systematic rigor he had applied to epistemology. But the questions were different, not, what can I know? But, what ought I to do? Not, what are the conditions of experience? But, what are the conditions of moral action? He began with an observation. Nothing in the world or beyond it can be called good without qualification except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, perseverance, all these can be used for evil purposes. Health, wealth, power, all can corrupt. Even happiness is not unqualifiedly good if enjoyed by someone vicious. But a good will is good in itself, regardless of what it achieves. Even if it accomplishes nothing, even if it is completely powerless, a good will retains absolute worth. This was not a popular view. Most ethical theories made morality instrumental. Virtue leads to happiness. Good action produces good consequences. Moral rules serve social stability. But Kant rejected instrumentalism. Moral worth belongs to the will itself, not to outcomes. What matters is the principle on which you act, not the results you achieve. He distinguished acting in accordance with duty from acting from duty. A shopkeeper who gives correct change to avoid a bad reputation acts in accordance with duty, but not from duty. His action conforms to morality but has no moral worth. It is motivated by self-interest, not by respect for the moral law. For an action to have moral worth, it must be done from duty because it is right, regardless of inclination or consequence. This sounded harsh. It seemed to drain morality of emotion, to make duty cold and empty. Critics accused Kant of denigrating love, sympathy, compassion. He responded that he was not opposing these feelings. He was distinguishing moral worth from inclination. If you help someone because you feel compassion, your action is good and praiseworthy, but it lacks the specific quality that makes an action morally valuable. Feelings come and go. They depend on temperament and circumstance. The person who acts rightly even when feeling nothing, who helps from pure respect for duty, demonstrates moral worth more clearly than the person who acts from immediate sympathy. The point was not to eliminate feeling, but to ground morality on something more stable. Duty must be autonomous, self-legislated, not dependent on external authority or internal inclination. The moral law must come from reason itself. This was Kant's central claim. Morality is the self-legislation of rational beings. We are subject to moral law because we give ourselves that law through our rationality. He called the fundamental principle of morality the categorical imperative. An imperative is a command. A hypothetical imperative says, if you want X, do Y. It is conditional. If you want to be healthy, exercise. If you want to be trusted, tell the truth. The command depends on accepting the goal. But a categorical imperative says simply, do Y. It is unconditional. Tell the truth. Keep your promises. Respect others. These commands do not depend on what you want. They bind you regardless of your desires. Kant offered several formulations of the categorical imperative. The first and most famous: act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. The test is universalizability. Before acting, extract the principle underlying your action. Ask whether you could consistently will that everyone act on that principle. If not, the action is wrong. Consider lying. Suppose you need money and consider making a false promise. You would borrow with no intention of repaying. The maxim is, when I need money, I will promise to repay even if I do not intend to. Can you universalize this? Can you will that everyone make false promises when convenient? No, because if everyone did this, promises would become meaningless. No one would trust them. The institution of promising would collapse. So willing the maxim universal contradicts itself. Therefore, lying is wrong. The argument was not consequentialist. Kant was not saying, if everyone lied, society would be worse. He was saying, you cannot rationally will that everyone lie, because willing this contradicts the very purpose of the action you are contemplating. You want to use the institution of promising while simultaneously destroying it. This is incoherent. The test ruled out many actions. Theft, murder, fraud, all failed universalizability. But the test also generated positive duties. Suppose you refuse to help others in need, adopting the maxim, I will never assist anyone. Could you will this universal? No, because you are a finite being who might someday need help yourself. Willing that no one ever helps anyone contradicts your own rational will as a being who might require assistance. Therefore, you have a duty to help others. Critics immediately objected. The universalizability test seemed empty. Almost any maxim could be formulated to pass it. A maxim like, I will lie when it serves my interest and I can get away with it might fail, but what about I will lie when necessary to save an innocent life? Could we universalize that? It seemed like we could. But then, was lying sometimes permissible? Kant's answer was no. The categorical imperative admitted no exceptions, but his position generated paradoxes that troubled readers. The most famous case, the inquiring murderer. Suppose a murderer asks where your friend is hiding. If you tell the truth, your friend dies. If you lie, you save your friend. What should you do? Kant said you must tell the truth. Lying is always wrong. Many readers found this absurd. Surely saving a life justifies a lie. But Kant's position was more subtle than often portrayed. He was not saying consequences never matter. He was saying you cannot control consequences, only intentions. If you lie and the murderer believes you and leaves, you have used deception as a means. If you tell the truth and the murderer goes to the location but by chance your friend has moved, you are not responsible for the outcome. You acted rightly. Luck determined the rest. The debate continues. But Kant's point was that morality cannot be situational. If moral rules admit exceptions whenever consequences seem bad, they cease being rules at all. They become calculations of benefit. And who judges benefit? Under pressure, people justify terrible actions by appealing to circumstances. Kant wanted moral law to be absolute, not flexible according to convenience. He offered a second formulation of the categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This was the humanity formula. It captured something central to morality, respect for persons. Every person has dignity, not merely price. You can put a price on commodities. They have exchange value. One is replaceable by another of equal value. But persons are not exchangeable. Each has absolute worth. To treat someone as merely a means is to use them as a tool for your purposes, disregarding their own ends, their own rationality, their own dignity. Slavery, deception, manipulation all violate the humanity formula by treating persons as mere instruments. The formula also implied duties to yourself. You must not treat your own humanity merely as a means. This ruled out suicide, not because life is sacred in a religious sense, but because suicide treats your rational nature as disposable when it becomes inconvenient. It also ruled out degrading behaviors that undermine your capacity for rational self-governance. You have duties to develop your talents, to preserve your health, to maintain your autonomy. Critics found the humanity formula more plausible than the universalizability formula. It seemed to capture moral intuitions about respect, dignity, and equal treatment. But questions remained. What exactly is humanity? Rationality? The capacity for self-legislation? Are non-rational beings owed no moral consideration? Kant's answer was that animals deserve humane treatment, not because they have rights, but because cruelty toward animals degrades our humanity. This struck many as inadequate. The third formulation of the categorical imperative combined the previous two. Act according to maxims that can at the same time have as their object themselves as universal laws of nature. Kant called this the formula of autonomy. It emphasized that moral law is self-given. We are not subject to external commands from God, society, or nature. We legislate for ourselves through reason. This is what it means to be autonomous. This is what gives humans dignity. The concept of autonomy was central to the entire project. Traditional moral theories had been heteronymous. They grounded morality in something outside the moral agent. Divine command theory said morality comes from God's will. Natural law theory said it comes from human nature or the structure of reality. Utilitarian theory said it comes from the principle of maximizing happiness. Kant rejected all of these, not because he opposed God, nature, or happiness, but because grounding morality externally undermines freedom. If morality comes from God's arbitrary will, then moral rules are just commands we happen to be subject to. We obey from fear or hope, not from genuine moral motivation. If morality comes from our desires for happiness, then we act from inclination, not duty. Only when we recognize that moral law comes from our own rational nature do we act truly freely. Freedom is not doing whatever you want. Freedom is acting according to laws you give yourself through reason. This paradox, that true freedom consists in following law, was central to Kant's moral philosophy. We think of law as constraint, as limitation of freedom, but moral law is different. It is the law of reason itself. When you act morally, you act according to your deepest nature as a rational being. When you act immorally, you are governed by external forces, desires, impulses, social pressure. Morality liberates you from determination by these alien causes. Kant drew a distinction between two standpoints. From the standpoint of sensibility, you are part of the natural world, subject to causal laws, determined by prior events. Your actions can be explained scientifically as effects of genetics, environment, psychology. From the standpoint of reason, you are free. You can step back from inclinations and ask what you ought to do. You can act on principles rather than impulses. Both standpoints are valid, but they apply to different aspects of human existence. This solved the problem of free will that had plagued the first critique. There, Kant had argued that theoretical reason cannot prove freedom. Determinism holds within the phenomenal world. But he had also argued that things in themselves might not be determined. Now he completed the argument. As noumena, as things in ourselves, we are free. As phenomena, as empirical beings in time, we are determined. There is no contradiction because the standpoints differ. The solution was philosophically elegant but practically puzzling. How can I be both free and determined? How can the same action be simultaneously a natural event with natural causes and a free choice with moral responsibility? Kant's answer was that we cannot explain how this works. We can only recognize that it must work this way if morality is to be possible. The possibility of freedom cannot be proven theoretically, but it must be presupposed practically. In 1788, Kant published the Critique of Practical Reason. It was shorter than the first critique and more clearly organized. It applied the critical method to practical reason, examining how pure reason can be practical, how it can motivate action without reference to inclination or consequence. The book developed themes from the groundwork, but placed them in systematic context. The Critique of Practical Reason began with a striking claim. The moral law is a fact of reason. We do not derive moral obligation from something more basic. We cannot prove that we ought to be moral. We simply recognize the moral law immediately through reason. This recognition is primary. It cannot be explained or justified by reference to anything more fundamental. Consciousness of the moral law is what Kant called the fact of reason. This was not mysticism. Kant was not claiming special intuition or revelation. He meant that rational beings inevitably recognize moral obligation. When you contemplate lying, you know it is wrong. You may lie anyway. You may rationalize. But you cannot avoid recognizing the moral demand. This recognition is built into rational agency. You cannot reason practically without encountering aught. From this fact, Kant derived what he called the postulates of practical reason. These were not theoretical truths provable by pure reason. They were necessary presuppositions of moral life. 3 postulates: freedom, immortality, and God. Freedom was the first postulate. Morality requires that you can act on moral law regardless of inclination. If you are completely determined by natural causes, if every action follows necessarily from prior states, then ought implies cannot. But ought does imply can. Moral obligation would be meaningless if you lacked freedom. Therefore, you must presuppose your freedom as a practical agent, even though you cannot prove it theoretically. Immortality was the second postulate. The moral law demands perfect virtue, complete conformity of will with moral law. But this is impossible in finite time. No human achieves moral perfection during earthly life. Yet the moral law does not demand the impossible. It demands what can be achieved through indefinite progress. Therefore, you must presuppose immortality, endless continuation, allowing asymptotic approach to virtue. Not because you can prove the soul survives death, but because moral striving requires it. God was the third postulate. The moral law demands virtue. But virtue does not guarantee happiness. Good people suffer. Bad people prosper. This seems unjust. The highest good would combine virtue with proportionate happiness. But nature does not provide this combination. Therefore, you must posit a being who can harmonize virtue and happiness, who guarantees that moral effort ultimately makes sense. Again, not as a theoretical truth, but as a practical necessity. These postulates were controversial. Critics accused Kant of smuggling theology back in after evicting it from the front door. He had spent the first critique demolishing proofs of God and immortality, then reinstated both through practical reason. Was this consistent? Kant thought so. The postulates are not knowledge, they are rational faith. You cannot know God exists. You must hope God exists if moral striving is to be coherent. Hope is not knowledge, but it is not arbitrary either. It is grounded in the practical necessity of making sense of moral life. The structure was remarkable. Theoretical reason establishes limits. We cannot know things in themselves, cannot prove God or freedom or immortality. Practical reason operates within those limits, but makes demands. We must act as if we are free, as if we can progress morally, as if the universe ultimately supports moral effort. The first critique made room for faith by limiting knowledge. The second critique showed what faith was needed for. Kant distinguished 2 kinds of good, the useful and the moral. Happiness, health, wealth, these are conditional goods. They are good when possessed by good people. In the hands of the vicious, they become dangerous. But virtue is unconditionally good. A good will is good regardless of circumstances. This distinction cut through centuries of philosophical debate. The Greeks had asked, what is the good life? Most assumed virtue led to happiness. But what if it doesn't? What if virtue brings suffering? The question had troubled Plato, who constructed elaborate myths about afterlife justice to reconcile virtue with reward. Kant accepted the tension. Virtue and happiness are different goods. Virtue is what you control. Happiness depends on fortune. The moral law demands virtue, not happiness. Your duty is to act rightly, not to ensure good outcomes. This was deeply Stoic. The Stoics had taught that virtue alone suffices for the good life, that external circumstances are indifferent. Kant absorbed this but added Christian elements, the hope for ultimate justice, the postulate of God who harmonizes virtue and happiness beyond this life. The practical philosophy transformed ethics. Before Kant, most moral theories were either naturalistic or theological. Naturalistic theories grounded morality in human nature, desires, or social utility. Theological theories grounded it in divine command. Kant proposed a third option, morality grounded in reason itself, in the structure of rational agency. This was neither naturalism nor theology, though it made room for both empirical psychology and religious faith. The groundwork and second critique established Kant as the dominant moral philosopher of the era. His influence spread beyond Germany. British philosophers engaged his work, some critically, some sympathetically. French thinkers absorbed his ideas through translations and commentaries. The categorical imperative became the subject of endless debate. What exactly did universalizability require? How did the various formulations relate? Were there genuine duties to oneself? Applied questions arose. What did Kantian ethics imply for politics, for law, for social reform? Kant addressed some of these in occasional essays. In 1784, he published What is Enlightenment? The answer was simple: sapere aude, dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding without guidance from another. Enlightenment is emergence from self-imposed immaturity. It requires freedom to use reason publicly, to question authority, to think independently. The essay was politically significant. Kant wrote it during the reign of Frederick the Great, a king who allowed considerable intellectual freedom while maintaining absolute political authority. Frederick famously said, "Argue as much as you like, but obey." Kant accepted this compromise. Public use of reason should be unrestricted. Scholars must be free to criticize, to question, to propose alternatives. But private use of reason, acting in an official capacity, required obedience. A soldier must obey orders, but as a scholar, he can critique military policy. A minister must preach church doctrine, but as a theologian, he can question it. The distinction between public and private reason seems backward now. We use private to mean individual, public to mean official. Kant meant the opposite. Public reason addressed the public as a scholar. Private reason addressed specific institutional roles. The key was maintaining space for free intellectual inquiry while acknowledging practical need for institutional stability. The essay concluded with guarded optimism. The age was not yet enlightened, but it was an age of enlightenment. Progress was occurring. People were beginning to think for themselves. Kant's confidence would be tested. The French Revolution was 5 years away. In 1785, Kant published Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. In 1788, the Critique of Practical Reason. Between them stood 3 years of continued teaching, correspondence, and elaboration. He wrote reviews, responded to critics, refined his positions. His reputation grew. Students traveled to Königsberg specifically to attend his lectures. The university was not prestigious by European standards, but Kant made it a center of philosophical activity. His routine continued unchanged: morning writing, afternoon lectures, the daily walk, evening socializing. He was in his 60s now, vigorous but aging. His health remained delicate. He managed through discipline and careful attention to routine. The routine was not mere habit, it was his method of productivity. By making daily life automatic, he freed mental energy for philosophy. Friends noticed increasing absent-mindedness. He would stop mid-sentence during walks, lost in thought. He forgot social obligations occasionally, but the work continued. 2 critiques complete, 1 remained. The system required an account of judgment, the faculty that connected understanding with reason, theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom. This would be his next project. But first came a series of shorter works applying the critical philosophy to specific domains. In 1790, the Critique of Judgment appeared. It completed the critical trilogy. The first critique addressed theoretical reason and the question, "What can I know?" The second addressed practical reason and the question, "What ought I to do?" The third addressed judgment and the question, "How do the domains of nature and freedom connect?" Kant was 66. He had spent 30 years building the system. Now he was filling gaps, showing how the parts fit together. Judgment occupies a middle position. Understanding provides rules for organizing sensory experience into knowledge. Reason provides principles for moral action. But how do we apply rules to particular cases? How do we recognize that this individual object falls under that general concept? This is the work of judgment. Kant distinguished 2 types, determinative and reflective. Determinative judgment applies known rules to particulars. Reflective judgment moves from particulars toward rules not yet known. It seeks patterns, purposes, meanings in experience. The Critique of Judgment divided into 2 parts, aesthetic judgment and teleological judgment. Aesthetic judgment concerns beauty and art. Teleological judgment concerns purposiveness in nature. Both involve reflective judgment. Both raise questions the first 2 critiques had not fully addressed, and both connected nature with freedom in unexpected ways. Aesthetic experience had not fit comfortably into the earlier critiques. Beauty is not a matter of knowledge. When you judge something beautiful, you are not asserting a fact about it, nor is beauty a moral quality. Yet aesthetic judgments seem different from mere expressions of personal preference. When you say a sunset is beautiful, you claim something universal. You expect others to agree. This universality without concepts puzzled Kant. He analyzed the judgment of taste. When you experience beauty, you feel pleasure, but not sensory pleasure like eating good food. Aesthetic pleasure is disinterested. It does not depend on the object's existence or utility. You do not need to possess the beautiful thing or use it for any purpose. You simply contemplate it. This disinterestedness distinguishes aesthetic pleasure from ordinary pleasure. Aesthetic judgment is also universal, not in the sense that everyone actually agrees, but in the sense that you expect agreement. You do not say, "This is beautiful to me." You say, "This is beautiful," implicitly claiming that others ought to find it beautiful too. Yet this universality has no concept behind it. You cannot prove beauty by pointing to properties the object possesses. You simply feel the harmony between imagination and understanding when perceiving the object. Kant distinguished beauty from the agreeable and from the good. The agreeable pleases the senses. It is subjective. One person likes coffee, another does not. No dispute arises because no universal claim is made. The good pleases through concepts. A morally good action satisfies rational criteria. The beautiful pleases through form without concepts. It engages our faculties in free play, creating harmony between imagination and understanding without subordinating one to the other. He also distinguished beauty from the sublime. The beautiful is found in bounded forms, a flower, a building, a melody. The sublime is encountered in the formless or boundless, the ocean, mountains, storms, the night sky. Beauty produces pleasure immediately. The sublime produces an initial displeasure, a sense of inadequacy before vastness, followed by pleasure when reason asserts its superiority over sensibility. We cannot imagine infinite space, but we can think it. This reveals reason's supremacy over imagination. The analysis of sublimity was striking. When you stand before a mountain range or violent storm, your senses are overwhelmed. You cannot take in the whole. Your imagination fails. But reason can conceive totalities that imagination cannot represent. This failure of imagination paradoxically reveals rational capacity. The sublime is the feeling of reason exceeding sensibility, of your rational nature transcending your empirical limitations. Kant extended the analysis to art. Natural beauty is immediate. Art requires genius. Genius is the talent for producing what no rule can teach, what cannot be learned through instruction alone. The genius creates original works that become exemplars, models for others. Yet genius itself does not know how it produces. The artist cannot fully explain or replicate the creative process. Artistic creation is spontaneous, not methodical. This account of genius was romantic in spirit. It emphasized originality, spontaneity, and the limitations of rules. But Kant maintained that genius requires discipline. Raw creativity without technical skill produces nonsense. Great art combines originality with mastery of form. The genius innovates within traditions, transforming rather than abandoning them. Fine art differs from craft. Craft is mechanical, following known rules to achieve predetermined ends. Art is aesthetic, producing objects whose value lies in their form rather than function. A well-made chair is craft. A sculpture is art, even if it serves no purpose beyond contemplation. This distinction was significant. It suggested art had its own domain, independent of utility or moral instruction. But Kant also discussed art's relationship to morality. Beautiful art can make us receptive to moral ideas. It can train sensibility to harmonize with reason. It can present ideals that elevate the soul. This was not crude didacticism. Art does not teach moral lessons explicitly. It prepares the mind to appreciate moral value by exercising the same harmony between faculties that moral action requires. The aesthetic sections of the third critique were dense but influential. They shaped German Romanticism and modern aesthetics. Schiller developed Kant's ideas about beauty's relationship to freedom. Schelling and Hegel placed art at the center of philosophical systems. The notion that aesthetic experience involves a distinctive kind of judgment, neither cognitive nor moral, became foundational for aesthetics as an independent discipline. But Kant's interest in judgment extended beyond beauty. The second part of the critique addressed teleology, purposiveness in nature. Organisms seem designed. They have parts that function together to maintain the whole. The heart pumps blood, the lungs oxygenate it, organs cooperate. This cooperation suggests purpose, as if organisms were created to achieve ends. Kant argued that we cannot avoid judging organisms teleologically. We cannot understand biological systems purely mechanically. When we examine a tree, we see that roots absorb nutrients, stems transport them, leaves produce energy, the parts serve the whole. The whole requires the parts. This reciprocal relationship is not mechanical causation, where one event produces another in linear sequence. It is purposive organization. But Kant insisted that teleological judgment is regulative, not constitutive. It is a principle we use to guide inquiry, not a fact about nature itself. We cannot prove that organisms actually have purposes. We cannot know whether nature was designed by an intelligence. We can only say that we must investigate organisms as if they were purposive systems. This as if is essential for biology, but does not yield theoretical knowledge. The argument paralleled his treatment of aesthetic judgment. Just as beauty involves subjective universality without concepts, teleology involves purposiveness without determinate purposes. We see purposive organization everywhere in nature, but we cannot determine the ultimate purpose. We cannot prove nature serves any final goal. We can only reflect that it appears to. This raised questions about divine design. The teleological argument for God's existence had always pointed to natural order as evidence of a designer. Kant had already refuted this argument in the first critique, but he acknowledged its power. The appearance of design is compelling. Organisms seem crafted, ecosystems seem balanced, the universe seems fine-tuned for life. How can we not infer a designer? Kant's answer was nuanced. The inference is natural. It is unavoidable for reflective judgment, but it does not constitute proof. At most, teleological observation points toward an intelligent architect who shapes matter. It does not prove a creator who produces matter from nothing. It does not prove infinite power or perfect benevolence, and it remains an inference from analogy, projecting human intentionality onto nature. The third critique attempted to unify the entire critical system. Judgment connects understanding and reason, nature and freedom. Aesthetic experience shows how sensibility can harmonize with reason without determination by concepts. Teleological reflection shows how nature, though mechanically explicable in principle, invites purposive interpretation. Both suggest that the phenomenal realm, though strictly determined by natural law, points beyond itself toward freedom and meaning. The book concluded with reflections on the highest good and the ultimate purpose of creation. If nature were purposive, what would be its final end? Kant's answer: the moral development of rational beings. Not human happiness, which is conditional and often corrupt, but human dignity, human capacity for moral autonomy. The ultimate purpose of nature, if it has one, is to produce beings capable of giving themselves moral law, capable of valuing duty over inclination, capable of acting freely. This was not theology in disguise. Kant was not claiming to know nature's purpose. He was reflecting on what purpose would make sense given the critical philosophy's commitments. If the phenomenal world exists for something beyond itself, that something must be moral agency, because moral agency is the one unconditioned good, the one value that does not depend on consequences or circumstances. The third critique was Kant's last major work in theoretical philosophy. It appeared in 1790, when Kant was 66 years old. The writing was less labored than the first critique, more confident. He had established his system. Now he was exploring its implications, showing how aesthetic experience and biological investigation fit within the critical framework. The book received less immediate attention than the first two critiques. Aesthetic theory seemed marginal compared to epistemology and ethics, but slowly it gained influence. Artists and poets found inspiration in Kant's account of genius and creativity. Biologists engaged his reflections on organism and purpose. The critique of judgment became central to debates about whether biology required distinctive methods irreducible to physics. Kant's account of teleology was particularly prescient. He argued that mechanical and teleological explanations were both necessary for biology. We can explain a bird's wing mechanically, bone structure, muscle attachment, aerodynamic properties. But we also understand the wing as for flying, as serving a purpose within the organism's life. Both perspectives are needed. Neither alone suffices. This anticipated debates that would intensify after Darwin. Evolution by natural selection explains how purposive organization arises without design. Random variation and differential survival produce adaptive features that appear designed but result from blind processes. Yet even evolutionary biology uses teleological language. Eyes are for seeing, hearts are for pumping. Biologists ask what organs are for, how they function, what purposes they serve. The language of purpose remains indispensable even in mechanistic frameworks. Kant would not have been surprised. He argued that reflective judgment necessarily interprets organisms teleologically. We cannot help seeing purposes in living systems. This does not commit us to intelligent design. It reveals something about how we must think about complex organized systems. Whether nature itself has purposes is unknowable. That we must investigate it as if it has purposes is inescapable. Between 1790 and 1795, Kant published several shorter works applying the critical philosophy to politics, history, and religion. These essays were more accessible than the critiques, written for educated general readers rather than specialists. They addressed urgent questions. What justifies political authority? Can humanity progress morally? What is the relationship between religion and morality? In 1793, he published On the Common Saying That May Be Correct in Theory, But It Is Useless in Practice. The title mocked a common objection to philosophical principles. Critics said Kant's moral philosophy was too abstract, too divorced from real human motivation and social circumstance. Kant responded that sound theory must inform practice. Practical wisdom without principles degenerates into opportunism. The essay defended the unity of theory and practice in politics and ethics. He argued for republican government grounded in social contract, not an actual historical contract, but a regulative idea. Laws are legitimate if they could have been agreed to by free and equal persons. This test rules out arbitrary authority and special privilege. It requires treating citizens as ends, not as means for rulers' purposes. Kant's political theory extended his moral philosophy into the public realm. He was cautious about revolution. The French Revolution had begun in 1789. Initial responses in Germany were mixed. Some intellectuals celebrated the overthrow of despotism, others feared chaos and violence. Kant's position was complex. He supported republican principles and condemned tyranny. But he argued that subjects lacked the right to rebel violently. Revolution violated the categorical imperative because it used force to destroy the legal order without which rights cannot exist. Yet he acknowledged that successful revolutions created new legitimate orders. Once established, revolutionary governments deserved obedience. The American and French republics, having replaced monarchies, now had authority. This seemed contradictory. How can revolution be wrong but its results legitimate? Kant never fully resolved the tension. He was a man of order, uncomfortable with violence, but sympathetic to Enlightenment ideals of equality and self-governance. In 1795, he published Toward Perpetual Peace, a work on international relations. The essay proposed conditions for ending war permanently. Kant argued that states should adopt republican constitutions, form a federation of free states, and guarantee universal hospitality to foreigners. War arises from unchecked sovereign power. Republican government, by requiring citizen consent for war, makes conflict less likely. A federation of republics could enforce peace without creating world empire. The argument was idealistic but grounded in practical reasoning. Perpetual peace serves every rational state's interest. War is destructive, expensive, and morally corrupting. Yet individual states cannot achieve peace alone. They require collective security. A federation allows states to preserve independence while cooperating against aggression. Kant was not naive. He knew states acted from interest, not morality, but he argued that properly understood interest aligned with moral principles. The essay influenced later peace movements and international law. The League of Nations and United Nations echoed Kant's federation of states. His claim that democratic governance reduces warfare has been extensively debated. Statistical evidence suggests democracies rarely war against each other, though they fight non-democracies regularly. Whether this confirms Kant's theory remains contested. Between political essays, Kant continued his regular activities, teaching, walking, dining with friends, but changes were coming. Frederick William II became King of Prussia in 1786. Unlike his predecessor, the new king was hostile to Enlightenment ideas. He strengthened censorship and promoted Orthodox religion. In 1788, he appointed Johann Christoph Wollner as Minister of Religious Affairs. Wollner issued edicts restricting what could be published or taught about religion. Kant ignored the edicts initially. In 1792, he submitted an essay on religion to the Normal Censorship Board. It was approved. In 1793, he submitted a second essay. The censors rejected it. Kant then published both essays, along with two more as a book, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. He argued that he had followed proper procedure. The theology faculty, not the censorship board, had jurisdiction over scholarly religious texts. This was technically correct, but politically risky. The book reinterpreted Christian doctrine through moral philosophy. Kant argued that true religion is moral. Ritual, dogma, and ecclesiastical authority are outer shells. The core is ethical. Respect for moral law, improvement of character, treatment of others as ends. He discussed original sin as the natural human tendency toward self-love over duty. He interpreted salvation as moral regeneration through reason. He suggested that Jesus represented the ideal of moral perfection, the model humanity should emulate. Orthodox believers were offended. Kant seemed to reduce Christianity to ethics, to dismiss revelation and mystery, to make God superfluous. Wollner's office took notice. In October 1794, Kant received a royal order. The king accused him of misusing philosophy to distort scripture, demanded he cease writing on religion, and threatened consequences if he disobeyed. Kant was shaken. He was a loyal subject, uncomfortable with direct confrontation. He responded carefully. He promised, as Your Majesty's faithful subject, to refrain from public statements on religion. He did not promise to abandon his views, only to remain silent. The promise was strategic. Frederick William II was ill. When the king died, the promise would expire. The incident revealed tensions between Enlightenment ideals and political reality. Kant advocated freedom of thought and expression, but he faced real consequences for exercising that freedom. His response was pragmatic. He preserved his principles privately while conceding publicly. This disappointed some supporters who wanted bolder resistance. But Kant was elderly, dependent on his position, averse to martyrdom. He kept his promise until Frederick William II died in 1797. Then he resumed writing on religion, feeling released from his vow. But the episode marked him. He was more cautious in later works, aware that philosophical inquiry could trigger political repression. Through the 1790s, his productivity continued, but his health declined. He suffered from insomnia, digestive problems, weakness. His handwriting became shakier, his memory showed gaps, but he kept lecturing, kept working. In 1797, he published The Metaphysics of Morals, a comprehensive account of legal and ethical duties. The book divided into the doctrine of right, concerning law and justice, and the doctrine of virtue, concerning personal ethics. The doctrine of right addressed property, contract, punishment, and constitutional law. Kant argued that private property requires state institutions. In a state of nature, possessions are uncertain and unstable. Law establishes definite ownership by specifying rules that bind everyone. This justified the state not as a convenience, but as a moral necessity. Without law, rights cannot exist. The state creates the framework within which moral persons can interact justly. He defended punishment through retribution. Criminals deserve punishment because they violated others' rights. Punishment is not primarily deterrence or rehabilitation. It is recognition of the criminal as a rational agent responsible for choices. To punish someone is to respect their agency, to hold them accountable. Not to punish is to treat them as less than fully human. This retributivism contrasted with utilitarian theories that justified punishment only by its consequences. Kant's views on punishment were harsh by modern standards. He supported the death penalty for murder, arguing that justice requires proportionality, life for life. He also held controversial views on sexuality, arguing that sexual relations outside marriage treated persons as mere means. Many of his specific judgments reflected 18th century Prussian attitudes. But the underlying principles, that law must respect human dignity, that persons are ends in themselves, remained influential. The doctrine of virtue addressed duties to oneself and others that go beyond legal requirement. You have duties not to lie, not to be servile, not to abuse your body or faculties. You have duties to develop your talents and to help others. These duties are imperfect. They admit latitude in how and when you fulfill them. Unlike perfect duties, which permit no exceptions, imperfect duties require judgment about circumstances. Kant was distinguishing moral from legal obligation. Law coerces external action. Morality concerns inner motivation. Law can forbid murder but cannot require that you act from love. It can enforce contracts but cannot command generosity. The distinction preserved personal freedom while justifying legal authority. Law regulates outer behavior necessary for social cooperation. Ethics addresses inner character beyond what law can touch. In 1798, Kant published Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, based on lectures he had given for decades. The book discussed human nature empirically, cognitive capacities, emotions, character types, social behavior. It was less technical than the critiques, filled with observations and examples. The tone was lighter, sometimes humorous. Here was Kant reflecting on human psychology, gender differences, national characters, practical wisdom. The book revealed a more worldly side. Kant discussed fashion, dinner conversation, marriage, friendship. He offered advice on managing emotions and cultivating virtue. He made generalizations about temperaments and peoples that modern readers find troubling. Some passages reflected prejudices common in 18th century Europe. Others showed psychological insight and recognition of human diversity. The anthropology was empirical, not transcendental. It described how humans actually are, not the conditions of possible experience. But it connected to the critical philosophy. Understanding human nature helps us recognize the gap between what we are and what we ought to be. It shows the obstacles to moral development: vanity, self-deception, conformity. It illustrates why moral philosophy cannot be purely abstract, but must engage with actual human capacities and limitations. What is Enlightenment? Remained his most widely read political essay. Published in 1784, it defined enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is inability to use understanding without guidance from another. It is self-imposed when it results not from lack of intelligence but from lack of courage. The motto, sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own reason. Kant identified obstacles to enlightenment. Laziness and cowardice make immaturity comfortable. Following others requires less effort than thinking independently. Authority figures benefit from keeping people dependent. They present their guidance as necessary, their rules as natural. But enlightenment requires rejecting tutelage, questioning authority, thinking for yourself. He distinguished private and public use of reason. In private use, acting in an official capacity, you must obey. A soldier executes orders, a civil servant implements policy, an officer of the church preaches doctrine. But in public use, addressing the public as a scholar, you must be free to criticize. The same soldier can publish essays questioning military strategy. The same civil servant can propose policy reforms. The same clergyman can debate theology. This distinction preserved social order while allowing intellectual progress. Institutions need discipline, but they also need criticism. Without freedom to question publicly, institutions stagnate. Without discipline in official roles, they collapse into chaos. The balance was delicate. Critics accused Kant of compromising too much with authority. He argued he was being realistic about what freedom requires in practice. The essay reflected optimism about gradual progress. Kant believed humanity was slowly becoming more enlightened. Education was spreading. Censorship was weakening. People were beginning to think critically. The process was incomplete and reversible, but the direction was hopeful. Enlightenment was possible if people had courage to use their reason. The conflict with Prussian authorities intensified Kant's interest in religion's proper role. He had always maintained that morality was independent of theology. You do not need to believe in God to know right from wrong. The moral law is accessible to reason alone. But he also believed religion could support morality. It could provide motivation where pure duty seemed insufficient. It could offer hope that moral effort ultimately makes sense. Religion within the boundaries of mere reason argued that true religion is moral religion. Ritual practices, theological doctrines, ecclesiastical organizations, all are secondary. What matters is the moral disposition, the commitment to live according to duty. Any religious teaching that undermines moral autonomy or encourages immoral behavior is false religion, regardless of how ancient or venerated. Kant discussed evil's origin. He rejected the idea that humans are naturally evil or naturally good. Instead, humans have a propensity toward evil, a tendency to prioritize self-love over moral law. This propensity is not inevitable. We are free to overcome it, but it is universal. Everyone experiences the pull of inclination against duty. Original sin, Kant suggested, names this universal human condition, not inherited guilt but shared susceptibility to placing self-interest first. Moral regeneration requires what Kant called a revolution in disposition, not gradual improvement but fundamental reorientation. You must reverse the priority between self-love and moral law. Instead of following duty only when convenient, you must make duty the supreme principle and subordinate all inclinations to it. This transformation cannot be achieved through external commands or mechanical practices. It requires inner change, a free act of will adopting morality as its governing maxim. Christianity speaks of grace, divine assistance in moral transformation. Kant reinterpreted grace naturalistically. We cannot explain how moral conversion occurs. We cannot will it directly, because the will that needs converting is the one that must do the converting. Yet conversion happens. People do change fundamentally. Calling this grace acknowledges that moral transformation exceeds what we can fully understand or control, but it remains a rational possibility, not a supernatural intervention. He discussed the concept of a church. An ethical community is necessary because individuals struggle against evil alone. Moral support, encouragement, example, these help sustain moral commitment. A true church is an association of people united by moral law, not by dogma or authority. Its purpose is mutual moral improvement, not enforcement of belief. Such a church would be universal, open to all who commit to moral principles regardless of theological differences. Kant distinguished what he called ecclesiastical faith from pure rational faith. Ecclesiastical faith involves historical doctrines, scriptural interpretation, ritual practices specific to particular traditions. Rational faith involves only moral principles accessible to reason. Christianity contains both. Its historical elements, the life of Jesus, scriptural revelation, sacramental practices, are ecclesiastical. Its moral teachings, love your neighbor, treat others as you wish to be treated, repent and reform, are rational. The ecclesiastical elements serve a purpose. They make abstract moral principles concrete. Stories, rituals, and symbols engage imagination and emotion in ways pure reason cannot. They help ordinary people, who are not philosophers, grasp moral truths and commit to moral life. But ecclesiastical faith must eventually serve rational faith. Rituals that become ends in themselves, dogmas that contradict morality, authorities that demand blind obedience, all these corrupt religion. Kant argued that Christian doctrines could be interpreted rationally. The Trinity represents reason, nature, and will in their unity. The Incarnation represents the moral ideal taking human form. The resurrection represents the triumph of moral disposition over sensuous inclination. The Holy Spirit represents the moral community's sustaining power. These interpretations stripped traditional doctrines of supernatural content while preserving their moral significance. Orthodox Christians were not impressed. They accused Kant of rationalism, of reducing faith to ethics, of eliminating everything distinctively Christian. Kant's defense was that he was showing what in Christianity remained valid when subjected to rational criticism. Supernatural claims about miracles, prophecies, and divine intervention in natural processes could not be proven and often encouraged superstition. But the moral core of Christianity was sound and defensible. The book also addressed prayer, church attendance, and sacraments. Prayer could not influence God's will, since God's will is unchangeable. But prayer could influence the person praying, strengthening moral resolve. Church attendance was valuable for communal moral reinforcement, not because buildings were holy. Sacraments were meaningful as symbols of moral commitment, not as supernatural channels of grace. Everything ecclesiastical found justification only through moral purpose. This position was radical for its time. It subordinated all religious practice to moral evaluation. No ritual, no doctrine, no ecclesiastical authority had legitimacy independent of morality. Religion served morality, not the reverse. This inverted traditional theology, which held that morality depended on divine command. For Kant, morality was autonomous. Religion's role was purely supportive. The royal command in 1794 forced silence on these topics. Kant complied, but considered the matter closed when the king died in 1797. He had said what he believed needed saying. Religion properly understood supported enlightenment and moral autonomy. Religion improperly understood promoted superstition and submission to arbitrary authority. The critical philosophy distinguished the two. By the late 1790s, Kant's daily life was constrained by physical decline. His eyesight weakened. Reading and writing became difficult. He hired assistants to help with correspondence. His famous walk grew shorter. Some days he could not walk at all. He continued lecturing, but with increasing effort. Students noticed his confusion, his repetition, his difficulty following arguments. In 1796, he gave his last lecture at age 72. The university offered him emeritus status, allowing him to retire with pension. He accepted. For the first time in 50 years, he had no teaching obligations. He spent his time at home, receiving visitors, revising manuscripts, attempting new projects. But concentration was failing. He worked on a final systematic treatise, but could not organize the material coherently. His memory deteriorated noticeably. He forgot names of close friends. He repeated stories he had told moments before. His handwriting became nearly illegible. Sentences trailed off unfinished, yet he remained courteous, interested in conversation, concerned about his guests' comfort. The social graces persisted even as philosophical capacity faded. Former students visited regularly. They found him still recognizably Kant but diminished. He could discuss familiar topics, the categorical imperative, the structure of the critiques, but could not follow complex new arguments. He knew he was declining. This awareness troubled him. He had lived by mental discipline. Losing control of his mind was the loss he most feared. In 1798, his last published work appeared, The Conflict of the Faculties. It addressed disputes between philosophy and theology, philosophy and law, philosophy and medicine within universities. Kant argued that philosophy faculty must have freedom to examine all doctrines rationally, even those protected by political or ecclesiastical authority. The higher faculties, theology, law, medicine, served state purposes and thus accepted certain constraints, but philosophy must remain free to question everything. The argument returned to themes from what is enlightenment. Progress requires critical examination. Universities should protect this freedom even when conclusions challenge authority. Professional faculties train practitioners. Philosophy trains critical thinkers. Both are necessary. Neither should dominate the other. But philosophy must retain the right to assess claims made by other faculties according to rational standards. After 1800, Kant rarely left his house. He received few visitors. His servant Lampe had been dismissed years earlier, replaced by other attendants. Kant had grown irritable with Lampe, who had served him faithfully for decades. The dismissal troubled Kant afterward. He wrote in his notes, "The name Lampe must now be completely forgotten." But he could not forget. The note itself proved that. His household was managed by his last servant and by friends who checked on him. He ate little, he slept poorly, he sat in his study surrounded by papers he could no longer read. Former students reported that he sometimes did not recognize them. Other times he was lucid, discussing philosophy with his former clarity. The decline was uneven, with good days and bad days, but the trajectory was downward. He worked intermittently on what he called the opus posthumum, a final systematic work intended to complete the critical philosophy. The manuscript pages show his deterioration. Early sections are coherent, addressing problems about the transition from metaphysics to physics. Later sections fragment into repetitive notes, half-formed thoughts, crossed-out passages. The work was never published in his lifetime and remains difficult to interpret. In late 1803, his condition worsened significantly. He could no longer walk unassisted. He ate almost nothing. He slept most of the day. His physician, Dr. Wasianski, visited daily. Kant sometimes recognized him, sometimes did not. Wasianski later wrote a memoir describing these final months. The portrait was compassionate but unflinching. The great philosopher had become helpless, confused, occasionally delusional. Friends debated whether to move him to a hospital or care facility. They decided he would be more comfortable at home. Students and colleagues took turns sitting with him. He was rarely alone. He seemed unaware of most of what happened around him, but occasionally he would speak clearly, thanking someone for their kindness or making an observation about the weather. His breathing became labored in early February 1804. He developed a fever. Dr. Wasianski knew the end was near. On February 11th, Kant's condition deteriorated rapidly. He could not speak coherently. He drifted in and out of consciousness. That evening, offered a drink, he made a visible effort to thank his attendants properly, to maintain courtesy even in extremity. The next morning, February 12th, 1804, Immanuel Kant died. He was 79 years old. His last intelligible word, according to those present, was "Es ist gut." It is good or it is enough. Whether he meant his life, his work, or simply the moment, no one could say. The utterance entered legend, interpreted variously as acceptance, satisfaction, or resignation. News of Kant's death spread through Königsberg immediately. The university announced plans for an elaborate funeral. This was unusual. Kant had lived modestly, avoided public ceremony, sought no honors, but his intellectual stature demanded recognition. Officials understood that Königsberg had housed a thinker whose influence extended across Europe. The funeral would honor not just the man, but the philosopher. On February 28th, 16 days after his death, the funeral procession moved through the city. Thousands lined the streets. Students, professors, clergy, government officials, ordinary citizens, all came to witness. The coffin was carried from his house to the cathedral, followed by academic representatives, learned societies, and mourners. Church bells tolled. The procession took hours. He was buried in the professor's vault at Königsberg Cathedral. The location was fitting. He had spent his entire life within sight of this church, had walked past it thousands of times on his daily route. Now he rested beside colleagues and predecessors, part of the academic community he had served for half a century. Eulogies emphasized different aspects of his achievement. Some stressed his defense of reason against skepticism. Others highlighted his moral philosophy's emphasis on human dignity. Theologians noted his efforts to reconcile faith and reason, though some remained critical of his rationalism. All acknowledged that philosophy had changed because of him. His literary remains were extensive. Manuscripts, lecture notes, correspondence, private annotations filled his study. Friends and former students began organizing these materials. Some would be published as the opus posthumum, others as collections of notes and fragments. His lectures on logic, metaphysics, ethics, and anthropology would appear in editions based on student transcriptions. His correspondence would reveal the private man behind the public philosopher. The house on Prinzessin Street became a site of pilgrimage. Students visited the room where the critiques were written. They examined his books, his sparse furniture, the portrait of Rousseau that had hung above his desk. The university eventually acquired the property, preserving it as a memorial. Over time, as Königsberg's history grew complicated, becoming Kaliningrad after World War II, the house's fate became uncertain, but the room where Kant worked remained a point of reference. His influence spread rapidly after his death. The critical philosophy dominated German universities. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Schopenhauer all defined themselves in relation to Kant. They might reject his conclusions or transform his system, but they could not ignore him. Philosophy in Germany meant engaging with Kant. Even opponents who wanted to return to pre-Kantian metaphysics had to explain what was wrong with his critique. Beyond Germany, reception was mixed but significant. French philosophers were slower to absorb his work. Linguistic barriers and different philosophical traditions delayed translation and understanding. But by the mid-19th century, Kant was being seriously studied in France. British philosophers engaged him critically. They found his epistemology too idealistic, his ethics too rationalistic, but they recognized his importance and developed responses. His moral philosophy proved especially influential. The categorical imperative became the standard against which other ethical theories were measured. Utilitarians attacked Kant for ignoring consequences. Virtue ethicists criticized his neglect of character and emotion, but all recognized that he had articulated something essential about morality's authority and universality, the idea that persons have intrinsic worth, that humans are ends in themselves. This became central to modern ethics and political philosophy. Human rights discourse absorbed Kantian ideas. The concept of human dignity, the insistence on treating persons as ends, the universality of moral law, all these informed declarations and constitutions. Kant had grounded rights not in natural law or divine command, but in rational agency itself. This secular foundation proved durable. When 20th century thinkers sought to justify human rights without religious premises, they returned to Kant. His political philosophy influenced liberal thought. The social contract as regulative idea, republican government as moral requirement, perpetual peace through federation of free states, these concepts shaped debates about legitimate authority and international order. Rawls's theory of justice, probably the most influential political philosophy of the late 20th century, was explicitly Kantian. The original position was a device for testing whether principles were universalizable, just as Kant had tested maxims. His aesthetic theory transformed how art was understood. The idea that aesthetic judgment involves disinterested pleasure, that beauty is purposiveness without purpose, that genius creates original works. These concepts influenced Romantic and modernist movements. Artists and critics found in Kant a justification for art's autonomy, its independence from moral instruction or commercial utility. His impact on science was more complicated. The claim that scientific knowledge applies only to phenomena, not things in themselves, troubled scientists who believed they were discovering reality's true structure. But Kant's account of how mind structures experience influenced philosophy of science. The idea that observation is theory-laden, that we cannot access raw data independent of conceptual frameworks, echoed Kantian themes. Kant's influence on theology was profound and divisive. Liberal Protestants embraced his moral interpretation of religion. They agreed that ritual and dogma mattered less than ethical commitment. They saw Jesus as moral teacher rather than supernatural savior. But conservative theologians rejected Kantian rationalism. They insisted on revelation's priority, on grace's necessity, on doctrines that exceeded rational comprehension. Battles over Kant's religious thought continued for generations. His epistemology generated the most philosophical controversy. Was transcendental idealism coherent? Could we meaningfully speak of things in themselves while claiming they were unknowable? Did Kant successfully avoid both dogmatic rationalism and destructive skepticism? Or did his system collapse into contradictions? Interpretations multiplied. Some saw Kant as proto-phenomenologist. Others read him as semantic theorist concerned with meaning rather than metaphysics. Still others found in him resources for pragmatism or constructivism. The secondary literature became enormous. By the 20th century, books and articles on Kant numbered in thousands. Scholarly editions of his works appeared in multiple languages. Journals devoted entirely to Kant studies were founded. International conferences brought together specialists debating fine points of interpretation. He became an academic industry, studied with the same intensity as Plato or Aristotle. Yet despite scholarly attention, Kant remained difficult. Students encountering the first critique often found it nearly impenetrable. The vocabulary was technical, the arguments were dense, the structure was labyrinthine. Teachers developed strategies for making Kant accessible, but many readers gave up in frustration. His writing style, precise but ponderous, resisted easy summary. This very difficulty paradoxically enhanced his reputation. Philosophy that could be grasped immediately seemed shallow. Kant's difficulty seemed proportionate to his profundity. His personal life attracted curiosity. The bachelor professor who never left Königsberg, whose routine was so regular neighbors set clocks by him, who subordinated everything to intellectual work, this made a memorable story. Biographers sought to understand the man behind the philosophy. They found few dramatic events, no romantic entanglements, no financial scandals, no political intrigues, just decades of disciplined thinking, teaching, and writing. Some found this admirable. Kant's life exemplified dedication to ideas, willingness to sacrifice personal pleasure for intellectual achievement. Others found it sterile. Had Kant's isolation from experience limited his philosophy? Did his narrow provincial life prevent him from understanding human richness and diversity? The debate reflected broader questions about whether philosophy requires worldly engagement or benefits from monastic focus. His statement about two things filling the mind with awe, the starry sky above and the moral law within, became his most quoted words. The phrase captured both aspects of his critical philosophy. The starry sky represented nature, the domain of theoretical knowledge, the phenomenal world structured by understanding. The moral law represented freedom, the domain of practical reason, the noumenal dimension where humans transcend natural determination. Both inspired wonder, both revealed human dignity. We are natural beings subject to causal law. We are also rational agents capable of self-legislation. This dual nature defined humanity. The phrase appeared not in the critiques, but in the critique of practical reason's conclusion. There Kant reflected on how moral consciousness reveals something unconditioned within us. We cannot explain moral obligation naturalistically. It does not reduce to desire, emotion, or social conditioning. It comes from reason's autonomy, from our capacity to step back from inclinations and ask what we ought to do. This capacity elevates us above mere nature. It makes us citizens of two worlds, the sensible and the intelligible. Later thinkers interpreted this dual citizenship differently. Some emphasized the sensible world, arguing that humans are fundamentally natural beings whose reason evolved to serve biological needs. Moral sense results from social evolution, not transcendental freedom. This naturalistic reading reduced Kant's noumenal realm to illusion or metaphor. Others emphasized the intelligible world, arguing that consciousness transcends nature, that subjectivity cannot be explained mechanistically. This idealistic reading developed into phenomenology and existentialism. Kant himself maintained the tension. We must think of ourselves as free when acting morally. We must think of ourselves as determined when doing natural science. Both perspectives are valid within their domains. The perspectives conflict only if we illegitimately extend one beyond its proper scope. Theoretical reason studying nature cannot prove freedom. Practical reason acting morally cannot prove natural determinism false. Each domain has its own principles, its own validity. This solution satisfied few. It seemed to accept irreconcilable viewpoints rather than resolving their contradiction. Critics wanted unified understanding, not compartmentalized domains. But perhaps Kant was right that human knowledge inevitably faces limits. We cannot achieve the God's eye view that would reconcile all perspectives. We are stuck with multiple standpoints, each valid within its sphere, between which we must navigate. The critical philosophy was ultimately about recognizing limits. Limits of what we can know theoretically, limits of what we can achieve morally, limits of human understanding generally. This recognition was not defeatism, it was realism about human finitude. We are neither gods who grasp ultimate reality, nor animals who simply react to stimuli. We are rational beings with powerful capacities and definite constraints. Philosophy's task is mapping those capacities and constraints, showing what we can legitimately claim and what we must leave as hope rather than knowledge. Kant's tomb became a monument. In 1880, a new chapel was built around it, featuring his most famous quotation about the starry sky and moral law inscribed above. In 1924, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, Königsberg celebrated its most famous son. By then, the city was part of Germany, its Prussian character fully established. The university bore his name, streets bore his name, statues depicted him in characteristic pose, slightly stooped, lost in thought. World War II destroyed much of Königsberg. Soviet forces conquered the city in 1945. It became Kaliningrad, part of the USSR. German residents were expelled. Russian settlers replaced them. The cathedral was damaged, but survived. Kant's tomb endured despite surrounding devastation. The Soviets, officially atheist and materialist, nevertheless preserved the philosopher's resting place. Even ideological opponents acknowledged his historical importance. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the tomb became a tourist site. Visitors from around the world came to Kaliningrad specifically to see where Kant was buried. The cathedral was rebuilt, the tomb chapel was restored. Kant's presence became one of Kaliningrad's few links to its pre-war past. A German philosopher buried in a Russian city symbolized the complex, tragic history of Eastern Europe. His legacy continues evolving. Each generation reads Kant through its own concerns. 20th century analytical philosophers found in him proto-analyses of concepts and language. Continental philosophers found phenomenological and existential themes. Political philosophers found resources for liberalism and cosmopolitanism. Feminists criticized his gender assumptions while adapting his ethics. Environmental ethicists extended duties beyond humans while grounding them in rational agency. Some argue Kant's moment has passed. His system seems too elaborate, his metaphysics too obscure, his ethics too rigid for contemporary pluralistic societies. Others argue he remains indispensable. The problems he addressed, knowledge's foundations, morality's authority, freedom's compatibility with natural law, persist. His solutions may require revision, but his questions remain urgent. How do we justify scientific knowledge? What makes actions right or wrong? Can humans be both natural beings and free agents? These are permanent philosophical problems, and Kant provided the most systematic modern attempt to answer them. What is certain is that anyone engaging these questions must reckon with Kant. You can reject his answers, you can argue his system fails, but you cannot avoid his framing of issues. He established the terms contemporary philosophy still uses: phenomena and noumena, a priori and a posteriori, analytic and synthetic, hypothetical and categorical. These distinctions structure ongoing debates. Even philosophers who think Kant was fundamentally wrong must explain where and why. The man who never left Königsberg shaped how the world thinks. The bachelor professor who lived by rigid routine liberated philosophy from dogmatic slumber. The thinker who emphasized limits and finitude expanded human self-understanding. The old professor who lost his memory in his final years created a system that subsequent generations have never stopped remembering, interpreting, and arguing about. This was his achievement and his legacy. The starry sky above remains, the moral law within endures, and the philosophy that connected them, difficult, demanding, inexhaustible, continues illuminating human reason's possibilities and limits.